Good morning, everybody. This is Sally Handley, author of the Holly and Ivy Cozy Mystery Series, and welcome to the first quarter of Mystery Book Club. We are delighted today to have a new moderator, Alice Fidler. And if you have not read any of her books, you must, because she writes romantic suspense. I'll let her tell you some of the titles when I turn it over to her, but I highly recommend her books. I've enjoyed every one that I've read, and doubly delighted to have with us the guest author of today's book, Sight Unseen, Dana Cameron.
Hi,
So,
everyone.
without further ado, Ellis. Oh, one more thing. If you would like, you might want, because we have 27 people registered for this event. I don't know how many will actually show up, but if the screen gets a little too busy, you can, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, click on view and switch to speaker view so that just the person who is speaking comes in. Okay, so Ellis, take it away.
Well, hi, Dana. I'm
Hey,
so
Alice.
glad you could be here.
I am too. I am
This
too.
is the book we had today,
Mhm.
and it was very good. Dana, I chose archaeology as my theme for the three books for this quarter, and this
Nice.
is the first one.
Hmm.
I just find archaeology fascinating, although I don't do anything beyond digging my garden.
You can
And
learn a lot from that, that's for sure.
yes, but I really did enjoy it.
Thank you so
And
much.
Dana is an archaeologist,
Oh,
which is very nice, not just research through the internet, but she's actually done it. And she has several books in the um, Emma, suddenly I've forgotten her name,
Emma
Fielding.
Fielding.
Emma Fielding series, three of which at least have been made into movies for Hallmark.
Mhm.
There are a lot of differences between the book and the movies, but they are still fun.
Mhm.
You just have to accept that it's a different thing.
Yep. Yep,
And
for
they
sure.
kept the main theme of the of the mystery, which I enjoyed. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about yourself? Do you have anything coming up that we'd like to know about?
Oh, goodness. First, I'd like to say thank you to you, Alice, and to Sally for inviting me, and appreciate everyone signing up, and hope everyone has a good time today. About me, wanted to be an archaeologist when I was very young. I wanted to be a writer, about 4 or 5 as soon as I started to read. And then I sort of got the idea that I was going to have experiences, which none of which sounded very nice, like running with the bulls. It's a very Hemingway-esque notion of, getting into bar fights. And so I'm like, no, 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 I don't like adventures. So by the time I was 10, I discovered the idea of archaeology. And that drove me through high school, college, graduate school. And I loved it. It combined all the things that I love, which is research and languages and travel and putting together puzzles and social research, looking at how people lived. Um, and I did that for about 20 years. I worked mostly in New England. I did some work in England. But what started me on a life of crime writing, was the incident that was the focal incident in Sight Unseen. I was working with my boss on a site in Maine. We were mapping, and a guy with a metal detector came out. And in Maine, you need to have a state permit to use a metal detector on state property. And of course, we had done all of our legal work and were invited to be there. Um, and the guy started digging, which is an absolute no-no. So we spoke up, and he pulled a gun on us.
Oh, wow.
And this
For
is,
real.
mid-coast vacation land, Maine. I've had friends who've worked in very, very dangerous parts of the world. And so it was quite shocking to me. And I was just behind the transit, which, is horribly outdated these days, but the tripod with the little measuring device for figuring out the mapping. And he kept waving the gun at us until finally the woman who was with him said, "We don't want trouble." I'm like, well, he's the one who showed up and started digging and pointing guns. So we went to the sheriff and did our best to identify him. And I was telling a friend about this a few months later, and she says, "You need to write this down." And I said, why? She says, that doesn't happen to normal people. And I'm like, well, it sort of happens to friends of mine all the time. Like the time that a cement mixer rolled off the highway in New Jersey and almost landed on the site where we had been working, but we were having a late lunch, thank heaven. Or
Oh,
friends in the Midwest who got shot at because they were digging too close to someone's still that was hidden out in the woods. And she goes, no, 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 this doesn't happen to regular people. You need to write this down. And all of a sudden, that old urge from when I was a kid to be a writer and all the skills I learned as an archaeologist about interpreting what people write down and what they mean by it and what they leave behind said, oh, that said to me that this had the makings of a detective story. So I started from there, a guy with a gun and a metal detector on a site in Maine. And that's how I got started. So it led to 6 Emma Fielding books, archaeology mysteries. Um, and then 3 more urban fantasy books featuring an archaeology student who doesn't know she's a werewolf. Those are the Fangborn books. And then led to some historical fiction, which I love writing. I've written Sherlock Holmes pastiche. I've written an espionage thriller, which I had the best time doing because I got to do all the things I would never do in real life in very controlled environments, like learning how to fight and learning about weapons and firearms. And it eventually led to uh, Anna Hoyt, which is an historical crime novel set in 18th century Boston. So again, I'm using my background in archaeology and what I studied to um, to feed into my fiction, which I love because I love talking to people about archaeology. I still get a rush visiting sites, and it just affects the way I see the world. So, despite the fact that I've been writing for the past 20 years, the archaeology is still in there.
Well, it certainly showed in this book. And I really wondered, is there a possibility of a site that's much older than Jamestown?
Uh, in the mainland U.S.,
Yes.
it's possible. I think the fact that um, the fort I was working on in Maine was 1607, dated to the same just after Jamestown was settled. Um, and no one had known about it. There was a survey there in the 1960s, and my boss had been going on a vacation up there and saw this thing. This is the earliest settlement in Maine, 1607. And he goes, that can't be right. And then we found out it was. So it was the earliest sustained English colony north of Jamestown. Plymouth wasn't until 1620 or so. There is a possibility, of course, people know about Lansdowne Meadows in Greenland, which is a Viking Age site. But we don't have any good evidence for European settlement in this area before 1607. Um, of course, you have the Spanish farther south. But if
Yeah.
we're talking about New England, what's now Canada and New England, then we don't have good evidence for it. It is possible, but we just haven't found the really the kind of evidence you need to say yes, this certainly happened.
I thought it gave it a really good reason for people to be so focused on it, where ambition and treasure hunting and everything played into it. I liked that idea a lot. And
Yeah,
I wondered if it could possibly be real.
it is based on the site that I worked on in Maine, and what I always liked about this, and this is the kind of you talked about ambition and that sort of thing. When I was going to conventions or conferences rather with other archaeologists, the folks from Jamestown always had the best artifacts. They had what they have there is such a wealth of information, but they always had intact artifacts. They had the neatest burial sites, all this information, and they're always very excited. It's like, well, we could date this between 1607 and 1615, and that, excuse me, I'd show up with a padded envelope through broken bits. I said we can date this from 1607 to 1608 because that was the only time that they were there. And so that was just the sort of I don't want to say one-upmanship, but the sort of games that archaeologists like to play, like who's got the oldest stuff, who's got the most intriguing stuff, and how we can talk to each other about making all of it count to all different types of history and archaeology.
It's good. I like that.
Yeah.
It made everybody's motives believable.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that people are ambitious and they're ambitious for different things. And some people just love the job. They love the putting the puzzle together. Other folks want the career advancement, or they want to be, um, in the press or find, you hear a lot about the work that goes on in the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and in Central America, where you have great monumental architecture and all sorts of things. But in New England, for me, it's really more about looking at how everyday lives were lived. You're not going to have giant, you're not going to often have monumental architecture. You're not going to have caches of gold coins, generally speaking. So everything that we find, for the most part, and this is true for most archaeologists, is trash. It's what's been disposed of. But it's going through that discard is that's how we learn about how people really lived. And I love that. So
Um, Is there anything special you'd like to tell us about it, about writing it, or how you develop your characters? Are they very real? They seem like it.
they felt very real. They're based on bits of people around me. I never take one person
Yeah.
wholesale and just put them as a character unless I really, really, really dislike them. And then boom, that's I change the hair and makeup and that's, and the name. But usually it's the bad guys that I draw from my least favorite people. But um I it's funny. Emma is it's a lot about me. At the time I started writing this, I very much wanted to have my an academic career. I was looking for my forever job and tenure, and that's why I made it so important for her.
Mhm.
But with all the things that happened to her, I also wanted to make sure that she had the one thing in her life that was um, good and stable and safe for her, and that's why I gave her her husband Brian. Um,
I
and
would
what's
like to
funny,
see more of him.
yeah,
He's
I
interesting.
I had so much fun with him. Thank you. I wasn't sure who he was until I saw this sort of little situation playing out in a coffee house where the barista was letting orders pile up, but because he was having such fun teaching, helping someone with her chemistry homework, I'm like, that's my guy right there. Enthusiasm, cares about other people, wants to share information, and I'm just like, okay, that's Brian right there. There's a lot of my husband, James, in him. And James didn't like him at first because he never likes my male characters because a lot of him goes into it's like fish seeing the reflections sometimes. But by the end of the series, he had a lot invested in Brian, though, so he was very worried about Brian at the end of the series. Um, but also the weird and wonderful personalities you meet in academia. Um, you have people who are there because they don't know that's their whole life. You have people there who like are looking for a job where they don't necessarily have to work during the summer, which is largely untrue. There's there are folks there who just want to be the stars. They want to be on the shows you see on science channels and such. And that's all great, but it's just makes for such a mashup of personalities that it's hard not to get embroiled in that. And just say, nope, this is what I'm doing. That's what you're doing. That's great. We don't have to be at odds over this, but sometimes it happens. Some people aren't cut out for it, and they try and they try. And like one of the students in the book, I was really I had to tell someone that they weren't doing the work they needed to do to get where they wanted to go, and they weren't getting it. And so I had to basically say, I think you need to find another discipline or a different person who will be able to help you get to where you need to be. And that's heartbreaking. Um, but it was one of those things where the poor guy just kept bashing his head against the wall and wasn't getting anywhere to his dismay and to mine. So that was one of the low points. The high points is when you have a student who you didn't realize had some learning difficulties who got her MA because I just said, okay, you start writing the main point of your paragraph, you back it up, and then at the end of the paragraph, you lead it to the next one. You say what you're going to say there, and you just keep doing that until you have a thesis. And after she finished, I was so proud. But then, because she was my first student to get her degree, her graduate degree, but also because she said, "Yeah, no one's ever been able to teach me how to do something like this before." And so, that was one of the very high points for me. Um, Even the days when I was working on my own dissertation and having a bad time, people would come into the museum and say, "Hey, could you talk to my kid about being an archaeologist?" And I'd sort of say, "Okay," and I'd do it, and they go, "Oh, we can see how much you love it." I'm like, "Really? If you can see it today, it's it's a good day because I am not feeling it today." But you know how it is. Um, and so the people come to the past to study in the past and want to learn about it for different reasons. In some of the books, I have it be because they want to know what their family contributed to the town history. Some people think they're going to find buried treasure. Um, some people think you're going to bring up secrets about the past that they don't want brought up. And that's really, when you have all of these ideas about archaeologists, awakening forces best left undisturbed and all, the stuff you see in very popular fiction, science fiction, and horror in particular. It's more, I think, that comes from the germ of truth, where archaeologists find out things that don't always make people very comfortable. And I think that's part and parcel of learning about history and moving forward from that. So it's something that it still means a huge amount to me. I still get excited. My husband and I travel and we go see whatever ruins are nearby. And like me, for me, it's not even work because I don't know anything about it. Nothing is on the line. I could just go and soak it up and have fun with it. So that's been a great joy, even though I'm not actively in the field anymore, is being able to travel and let other folks tell me about their exciting work.
Excuse me, I have a
Oh,
question
please.
for
Yeah.
you. Um, it was my first book that with archaeology in
Mhm.
it, and I loved it. And I thought the person who wrote it must know a lot about it. The question is, all your books are based in the United States, or have you some books where the archaeology takes place abroad?
The second book takes place in England, and
Okay,
that's as far afield as I have
okay.
gone with that. Um, but thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. One of the things, Yolanda, that meant a lot to me in writing the book was that a lot of things I've seen was, as I mentioned before, where you have very trite tropes of archaeologists causing trouble
Mhm.
or that sort of thing, or they're obsessive, which they can be, I admit that, or uh, they only go to very beautiful, faraway places. I wanted to show what it was like to do the work and
Thank you.
to show you that archaeology happens everywhere. It can happen in your backyard. It can happen in your garden.
Mhm.
Sally and I were talking about that. One of my students, I was out to dinner and just she ran up and came around and hugged me and says, "I was digging my garden and I found creamware and I knew what it was." And I'm like, "Yay, good for you." And so she says, "I didn't write all the notes." I'm like, "It's okay. It's your garden. You can do whatever you want. But if you find something more, come tell me and we'll talk about it." But it was to let people know what the job was really like and the difference between how the British do their work and how Americans do is very different. It's very
Alright.
great. And so that's why I had fun when I was studying there to compare how we did things versus how they did. And it was really quite amazing. I learned so much, and I hope they did from me. Um, but the other thing was interesting when you talk about someone who knows the material.
Mhm.
At first, when I first went to a writing conference, the person I was working with, my instructor, said, "So what do you do for a living?" I'm like, "I'm an archaeologist." I'm like, and this was like very bad because I was showing them a draft of Sight Unseen, and he goes, "Ah, I can't tell that because there's nothing about the details." I'm like, "Oh, all of my friends and my family know exactly what it is. So that's all the boring stuff." He says, "No, no, we want all that." And so that reminded me to put in what it feels like physically, what it can smell like, what it sounds like when
Mhm.
you're doing that kind of work. And it's like that was such a good perspective for me. I'm like, "Oh, right, right. Not everyone knows this, and I'm excited about it." And so is my goal, is to communicate some of that to folks.
Thank you. Really, I could almost smell the earth what
Yes.
they were doing. I could almost smell it. You described it so good. Well, you described a lot of things very well.
Thank you.
I really thought I'm smelling where they are.
Oh, that
Right.
means so much to me because it's so much you use all of the senses and not and that's surprising what you learn. And so that makes me very happy. Thank you.
I have a
Enjoyed
question.
reading. Oh,
Oh,
I was just gonna say, I enjoyed how dirty she got and the
yeah.
description of, the grime and the dirt. And it wasn't that she stayed all pristine and nice and
No.
picked up a little thing.
No.
She really got in there and dug, and I like that.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny because the one of the things that when particularly when I'd be coming home to I live outside of Boston, coming back from Maine after the season was over, my husband would answer the door, say, "Go upstairs, take a shower, don't touch anything," because it was just and he says, "And put all your dirty stuff in like one pile so we can just keep it from spreading and getting all over the place. The cats getting into it." Because I was the last couple days of our dig are always the most exciting and the most challenging, and you get the filthiest, pretty much.
Oh,
So there was another question, I think.
Yes, I have a question.
Mm,
And this is about the main character, Emma.
mm,
Now, I saw the Hallmark movies. I think I saw two of them, but I
mm,
haven't seen them in a long time. But I have to say, as soon as I started to read the book, I loved Emma's voice. I loved the character. And it was very different. And I want to know if it was different for you.
mm.
um, I found it different from the character as I remembered her from the movie. I loved her. I mean, the fact that she's in a shower drinking a beer, she's my kind of girl, okay? And I just got the biggest kick out of that. And I just enjoyed her voice and her character and how she handled things. And she was so human, and she could be very impatient with people, but she could also be very helpful and nurturing to her students as well. So my question is, am I mistaken, or what is the character in the movie different from the character in the book?
Oh, I think so, and I think that was one of the main things going into the Hallmark movies was that I understood right from the beginning that it was going to be their thing. It was going to be their interpretation of my work because they know their audiences better than I do. And so it's my books are there for everyone, and if they like them, great. If they like the other interpretation, the Hallmark version, that's great too. Um, and it is very different because they always have someone else doing the script writing.
Mhm.
And the first person I never met her who wrote the Sight Unseen movie, but it was very nice to know that I knew the screenwriter from another publishing job who wrote the second two. And so while the first one was very close to the events of the book for the most part, the other two were more closer to the spirit of the books. And I think, allowed Emma to have a little bit more fun, a little bit more, not be quite so serious. But the thing that was important to me was that um, whatever they did with the character, with my character, I wanted Emma to be, I wanted her to be smart. I wanted her to use her brains and logic to solve the puzzle. I wanted her to rely on science, and I wanted her to stick up for her friends and her family and not be afraid of getting physical. And as long as that was the case, and they nailed that. I didn't even get a chance to talk to anyone about it, but those are the things that mattered most to me. I had some readers say who were really offended. I'm like, but Courtney Thorne Smith is in her 50s and she's blonde. I'm like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the least because the character was given, the actor was given all the things for Emma that I felt were important, all the things about her.
She wasn't married in the movie though, right?
No, no, and that
Yeah.
was the funny thing because I mentioned before that James was at first not so crazy about Brian, but then it's like, oh, I wonder who they're going to cast in My Honey. It's a Hallmark movie. They're going to have a romance.
I think that goes without saying.
Yeah. And so I said I knew he was going to be the first one on the chopping block, as it were. Um, but and so he was a little broke, but they had to have that. They have to have that. They have the overarching story where you have the kind of cute meet and it's a little bit of hostility, and then you realize there's something on both sides, and then the third one there might be a kiss.
Yeah.
So
And heaven forbid we have a happily married couple.
well, it's interesting to me because I guess that was kind of shocking to the mystery community too, because with a few exceptions, a lot of writers keep their characters single so they can have a romance develop. And I hadn't even thought about that because my own relationship is that important to me that I wanted to at least have that foundation for Emma when other things were going badly. And everyone said, "Yeah, wow, you gave her a husband. That's crazy." I'm like, "Okay." um, I think I've written crazier things, but a happy marriage, I didn't think was going to be on the top of the list. But here's the thing. Yolanda earlier was talking about the smells and everything. We got a chance to visit the set, and that was a great privilege. Usually they keep the novelist and the actors and everything completely as far apart because it's all in their hands. But we walked on, and it was filmed in Victoria, British Columbia, and they were filming on the side of the island where the sun was coming up in the east in the morning, not just and or of course it always comes up in the east, but where the angle was right on the island for you to see that. And the trees looked vaguely like Maine. I mean, not really, but they were using the tents that we'd used on the site to hide the cameras and such. And they had just been digging the units. And my husband and I saw this troop of folks coming over and they were covered in filth. And he goes, "Oh, those are the graduate students." I'm like, "No, no, no. Um, that's probably the crew who have been digging. And like, if they're gonna have this on Hallmark, it's gonna be like the little smear of cute dirt or a little bit on the nose that someone could wipe off in a very but it smelled right. And I was like, this is getting a little strange. But then I'd heard the actor, Courtney Thorne Smith, saying things that Emma said that I had also said to my own students. And so that got to be really eerie. And I'm like, okay, what is going on here? But it was so much fun. And I learned so much. And all I wanted to do was just step out of the way. And if someone was hanging around, ask them what they did. And it was always the most important job on the set, which I loved. Everyone felt that sense of like without them, the movie would not work. But it is there were differences, and heavens knows it's not a documentary about how to do archaeology. Um, I was sitting there watching one student like flinging his trowel to dirt, and James said, if I did that on one of your sites, you'd smack me." I'm like, "I wouldn't smack you, but I would say, no, we don't do that." uh, um, Apparently my words were sharper than I intended, and he thought that I was, yelling at. I wasn't. I was just saying, no, no, less playing with trowel, more notes, write more notes, use more adjectives, tell me everything, write more notes. So it was fun for me to be able to
It's
sort of see. It was more about getting people. The movies are more about getting people interested in archaeology and the books for me. And if they are just there to have a good time, that's great too. Oh,
I wanted to comment on your words that you said
mhm.
that the book is not a manual for archaeology, but yet I learned so much. I
Thank you.
learned so much. All the layers and not going too deep in the beginning and how they do. I learned a lot.
I'm so glad. That was one of the things that also meant something to me was like, if I wasn't gonna get that ultimate tenure track dream job, I would still get to teach people what I know and love about archaeology. And it's tricky because you have to like, for example, the character of Meg came up when I needed someone to be there to go along with the reader and have things explained. So if you have a new like a kid who comes onto your book setting, or someone from out of town, they're the way that you can give the information to the reader without it feeling like an exposition dump. What I refer to as um, the pig and the python thing. It's like you have story, 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 big lot of information, story, story, story. Um, so it's important. It was finding the balance between me lecturing, which is one thing, and me telling a fun adventure story with a mystery was another. And I was told by several people, including my beta readers, my agent, my editor, it's like, ah, this is not the place where you have to footnotes. You don't get to do that here. So you have to break it up so that the learning part is sort of interwoven with the other parts, the action and the clues that lead to it. So it's a balancing act because it's a different audience. Um, it's a different audience altogether. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Were you very excited when you found out that someone was interested in making a movie?
Yeah, I was,
I
but
mean, I was over the moon.
but no, it was funny because I never expected it to happen. Because I've had friends who've had their work optioned, which means someone is paying you a certain amount to take a chance to maybe develop it into a movie show or a movie or a TV show. And people who have had movies made or a series made, but everyone says the same thing. You get the check, you cash it, and you forget about it because the odds are against it ever happening, because of all the things you have to go through. And so my agent emailed me and said, does anyone own the film rights to Emma Fielding? I'm like, no. He goes, okay, well, we have an interest, so I'll let you know. I'm like, great. And that was in August, and I figured, cool. They had made a deal with us within a few months and began filming in February or March. And the thing was out within a year. So that was astonishing to me. I never really got past the notion that maybe my friends were playing some kind of joke on me or something, and it didn't feel real until I went to Canada that first day and saw the set they were using for the sheriff's office. And they had an American flag and a Maine flag flying over. I'm like, this is Canada. They don't do this without good reason. And so then I realized, okay, this is for real. And it took me actually being there to absorb it, really. Um, but I did not expect it to happen. It happened 10 years after the book technically went out of print. I tried to get HarperCollins to re-release it with the Hallmark folks and got them talking, and then nothing came of it. It's like, it's all good. It's all good. But it was a very great surprise to me. Yeah. Darlene, did you have a question?
Uh, yes, a question and comment.
Mm,
I loved your descriptions,
thank you.
setting, people, and especially the weather. That last scene, because I worked, I said she had to work out in this kind of weather. Otherwise, there's no way you could do those descriptions. Could you give us some insight into how you wrote that last scene with the rain and
Well, I knew I wanted it to be dramatic, and I knew I wanted Emma to be off balance in more than one way. And she knew the site so well, having been there as a young person with her friend Pauline, having done a lot growing up there, and also she knew it intimately from having worked there. And so I wanted there to be darkness and weather working against her. There have been times where we've had to work in the rain because it was the last day. So we'd take sawhorses and put those blue tarps over our units while it was pelting rain and try to keep digging. Now, of course, there's no good light in there because the blue is making everything look odd, but you still have to keep working. And so you go out, you look at stuff, you go back in, you dig some more, and you're trying to keep it precise the whole time. Um, by the way, wearing foul weather gear is the only way to keep the mosquitoes in Maine from really going to lunch on you. Um, so there have been times where I had to batten down a site that I was working on before a hurricane came, and that meant trying to make sure that I was protecting everything the best I could. And so you start thinking about like, okay, I need plywood, not just tarps to cover up the units. I need stones. Where can I get them? Um, and you don't always get ideal weather. And sometimes it's very cold, and sometimes the ground isn't quite frozen, but you are. I did a project in Salem, Massachusetts, working on a wharf in March. And they had a big coffer dam built around it, just a structure to keep um, the inside of the wharf safe while the water was still around the outside. But it was the coldest I've ever been. The winds of the Atlantic was brutal, and it was wet, and so you're dealing in less than ideal circumstances. So part of it was personal experience. I've never had to be in that situation where she was, but I felt it, and I got so caught up in writing it that there's a moment where she's running down to the water and her coat gets snagged on the railing. Well, originally I had to get snagged on the door to the house, which of course I burned down in the first chapter or two. So I'm like, oh wait, we can't do that. So I just moved it around a little bit. But it was this part of it was remembering those physical sensations myself. And part of it was understanding the anxiety that goes into protecting a site when the weather is bad. And part of it was just really wanting to have a really big showdown. And that was fun. I like writing action scenes. So it's yeah, weather's not always your friend, but when it's glorious, it's an amazing thing. So I've loved the fact that I've quite frequently been able to work near water. So you always have the ocean. You can think about early settlement and colonization and shipping and how the whole Northeast developed this. So it's been that has been a real privilege.
Are you going to lunch?
I'm sorry.
No, it's my husband asking me something.
Oh, okay. It's okay.
We were talking about a book. Yeah.
Anyone have any other questions? Let's see. I
What
can tell you.
the next one you
Oh,
said is
sorry.
in England?
Yes.
Oh,
That one is Grave Consequences. I had interesting stories. I'd written the fourth book, what became the fourth book, immediately after I wrote Sight Unseen. So I learned so much. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and I got it written. I handed it to my editor, and she says, um, "We can't publish this." I'm like, "Why not?" She says, "It's too soon. We need to have Emma out in the field more." This was set in a library,
Oh.
and I'm like, "Okay." So I had to write that book in about 3 months, which was way too fast for my comfort. And I think some of it shows in the book because it's very hectic in a lot of ways, the pacing. But what I did was I took the experiences I had working in England when I was a student there and used those misunderstandings about how things work and having Emma be the outsider coming into a community that had a lot of secrets as outsiders tend to show up and ask the wrong question quite innocently, and then things unravel. So I wanted to talk about being a student there. I wanted to talk about the differences in the types of field work. I wanted to include a lot of the things that you tend to see in British dramas, like you're going to have a reference to, secrets connected to the Second World War. You're going to have, it's funny because you always have these certain things, certain beats that get hit in British dramas. And I figured I'll take a few of those too. Um, and then give Emma a terrible decision to have to make about her friends. Because part of this for me is, I think it's something I learned from reading Dorothy Sayers, was not just the solving of the crime, but the aftermath. When Peter Wimsey would solve a crime, he would feel very acutely that he had sent a person to the hangman. And I liked the idea of there being consequences, of there being, she's doing this stuff because she has the skills and she has a dedication to what's right, even if it's not always what's legal or what's lawful. And I wanted her to have to wrestle with those things. And like, is it okay for her? Is it appropriate for her to be doing this? So I liked that sort of that combination of emotional and intellectual conflicts. So that's what happens there. And plus I got to remember a lot of fun I had visiting the pubs and talking about every subject under the sun, which is just terrific fun.
It's good.
I
I
have a
happened to
question.
read the last scene before I had to go out for something, and we're having miserable weather the other day. It was cold and wet, and I
Mm.
thought, why didn't we get a book that was in the sun?
Yeah.
Because I know it made it colder, having just come from that scene.
Yeah.
I could really feel it. But
It's
in England, you don't get a lot of sun anyway.
yeah. Well, it's funny. The last couple times I've been in recent years, it's been hot and in the 80s,
Wow.
which is I like going to I like going there because I like the atmosphere. I like the um, I like the overcast. I like the chilly weather. And so it's been disappointing when it's like, yeah, 80 degrees and 85 and everyone's taking their shirt off, which I find hideously inappropriate. And there's no air conditioning because it's Europe. But uh
Hmm.
but there you go. And that's just my own particular preference, and there's not a whole lot anyone can do about that these days. So it was fun. I have to ask, Ellis, what are the other books you're reading for archaeology?
The next one is The Crossing Places by Ellie Griffiths,
Mm-hmm.
which is British.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one is Crocodile on the Sandbank by Elizabeth Peters.
Oh, it's been a while since I've read any of the Griffiths books, but Crocodile and Sandbank is one of my top 5 mysteries ever.
Hmm.
It's
Um,
wonderful. I
it's
read it long ago. I have to read it again for
You'll
this.
have plenty of sun, plenty of
Yeah.
sun with that one. Elizabeth Peters, who is also an archaeologist and Egyptologist, and her nonfiction was published under Robert Mertz, and those are also wonderful books. They're very accessible. They are scholarly, but they are accessible, which is my favorite kind of scholarly work. And she was being published by HarperCollins while she was alive, and I was at Avon, so I was sitting at the kids' table at the HarperCollins dinners at I think it was Malice Domestic, and I got to go over and introduce her. And my editor was very kind, and so we talked about archaeology a bit. And later on, I had the great pleasure of being the Toastmaster at Malice Domestic, and she was the first honoree of the was it the Amelia Award for Historical Mystery? It was based on her character Amelia Peabody Emerson.
Hmm.
And she goes, "Oh, I remember you. I've read some of your stuff. It's quite good." And at that point, my head exploded. I went flying off, on wings. And if she was just being polite, that's fine too, because she really, if I had read her work before I'd started writing, I wouldn't have bothered writing. I wouldn't have, because within the first 3 pages or so, she has the tone of the period correct. She has the archaeology smack on, and she's funny, and she throws unexpected loops in there, like when we find out how Amelia is able to go abroad, and um, and it's not for any of the reasons that one might expect, and she just takes some of these tropes and turns them on her head, and it just those books have meant so much to me over the years. They've become a kind of code language amongst my friends. We were talking about getting dirty before, and my friend would say, "Oh, Emerson, another shirt ruined," when we were completely um, covered up in it. And we'd say, "Mind your diphthongs, Ramsey." And uh, there was one moment, this was a very particular, very personal memory for me. My friend and I were sitting on the dock after we'd taken off our boots and we were tired, it was hot. We were soaking our feet in the river, which was wonderfully cold, but I'd had the remains of a pedicure from 3 months ago, and the paint was all chipped off, and my legs were scratched, and and my friend looks at me and says, "Those are not the feet of a gentle lady." I'm like, "No, they are not." uh, it was so those have been real touchstones for me, both personally and professionally, and archaeologically. And
Hallmark probably would have rejected her also because she finds love in the first book,
yep,
and they're together from there on in.
and they're so well suited to each other. And I love the fact that there may be marital strife in those books, but it's not between Emerson and Amelia, Emerson and Peabody. It's they have it with their friends, and so you get to have those very real emotions without worrying about the couple you've become so attached to.
Yeah.
Um, and so I really appreciated that because you needed when so many other things in the global history, the archaeology, and their family life was going wrong. I wanted to have them as a bedrock. Um, and I love the fact that they argue over who proposed to whom. And the fact that they're both completely convinced that they're always right. And um, and the other thing we said at the end of the day, particularly at the end of the day, so I believe this calls for some form of liquid refreshment. So it's time for the beer in the shower, basically.
Dana, can you talk about your writing process?
Certainly, yes. It is it is chaotic. There are some people who start with scene one, page one, and just write it straight through. I write the scene that suggests something to me first, the thing that I think, oh wow, this could be really fun. So I write that. I don't necessarily know who everyone is, but when I know what's going on in that scene, I'm like, okay, there are some people here. I need to know about them. There are there are things at stake that I didn't know about before. What are those? And are there other things attached to that? And so I would sort of work from that one idea and I write out of order. I move things around. I don't outline. And that's just how I work. And so a friend of mine and I we're comparing our writing processes at a horror convention recently. And he pulled out this beautiful stack of matching notebooks, hardbound, this one pen he uses, and he talks about the 50 pages of outlining he does before every he was an attorney, and so he has a list of questions he asks all of his characters. And this is before he starts writing. And so I pulled out my writing process, which was a pile of uh, napkins, paper napkins, the backs of receipts, and a notebook that had seen better days. And I said, yeah, and somewhere in here is a book. And neither one of us would ever do what the other does, but it both gets us there in the end.
Yeah.
I always say that it's not whether you're left-handed or right-handed or you use a pencil to write or a computer, it's what gets the job done. So I have a pile of notes. I've always done this, in even my academic work. So my husband refers to these piles as dissertation notes because there's what looks like litter, but he's learned never to throw out anything that might have writing on it, because it could be the chapter, it could be, the conclusion.
But it sounds very much like the process that Emma went through at the site, where you collect things, you find things, and then one day, all of a sudden, she sits down and the site becomes clear to her.
Yeah. And
So
that's it.
yeah,
It
you're
is
echoing that process.
you go from the known to the unknown, which I'm pretty sure I put in that book. I probably put it in every book. You start with what you know and you sort of creep out and explore from there and say, okay, does this make sense? Does this all hold water? I was sitting, I don't know how many of you read fantasy, but I was sitting next to Terry Brooks, who wrote the Sword of Shannara and all the Shannara books at a science fiction convention, and he was saying, oh, I start page one, and so I told him my spiel about how I do it, and everyone, and he looked at me and says, "You're the kind of writer who terrifies me." Like, I'm sorry, it's how it works. It's how it works for me. And it was funny because, like, oh my God, Terry Brooks saw me. He talked to me. But the nice thing about that was that two young people came up to me afterwards and said, "Thank you for letting me know this, because we didn't think we could be real writers because we don't start with page one and work all the way through." I'm like, whatever. And I'm like, oh, bless you. Go do it. Write it, go grab all your, if it's on a chalkboard or a whiteboard, go do it and tell your story. So sometimes at some point during the middle or two-thirds of the way through the process, Mary, I will say, okay, these things have to happen because I kind of know what the ending is. And so I have to have this, and this. This has to happen. Something like this has to happen. And then someone has to do something. And that's as close as I get to outlining if I can possibly manage. So it's whatever gets the job done. It's not pretty. But it is, I will go through and be clearing up and I'm like, oh, this is what I needed to put over there. And I figured out what one random scene meant and where it had to go. So,
Mm.
I'm assuming we have some writers and aspiring writers here.
Mhm.
Very
Yes.
good. Do whatever it takes to get the words on the page. Um, Sally, you had mentioning about getting all the information together and coming to your conclusions from there and seeing something from that.
Right.
That same instructor who said, "What do you do for a living?" I don't see any details here. Also said that he had a moment where he was learning to write, to be a writer. That um, his girlfriend would go into the studio every day. She'd start chipping away at the stone, and she'd have something that looked more like her sculpture every day. And every day he'd have a pile of crumpled paper. And finally, he realized, oh, she has stone already made. She's just had to pick it out. I have to create stone, and then I have to chisel it into a rough shape and then to a finer and finer shape. So you have to have the ideas there to form the basis of the book, and then you can sort of, you know, sculpt it into what it needs to be and edit it in what it needs to be. I call it, you're going down into the word mines, you get your stone, and then you take it to the workshop and sort of your atelier and make it something wonderful, you hope.
I
So
particularly enjoyed your kind of skewering of the academic type characters. Um,
sorry,
I did.
I still
I
do.
taught a little bit. I taught on the college level English composition for a little bit, and yeah, it's interesting to be on the outside of that. Like you're not the tenure track person, but these people are very, and especially archaeology is a whole different thing. So yeah, I enjoyed the faculty meeting that she
Oh
just
God,
wanted to poke
that
her
was
eyes
so hard
out
to
at.
write. I didn't want to be there. I would gnaw off my own leg to get out of a faculty meeting if ever I could, and so that was a very real experience for me, unfortunately. And it's all about power plays, and it's just, and I get it, and it has to be because there's so little financial reward that any kind of advancement you can make, you try to get it, and sometimes people are kind and thoughtful about it, and sometimes they're not.
Mm.
So what are you going to do? Same, I mean, it's the same in any profession. Either, there are very high stakes and everyone's competing, or there are very few stakes, and so everyone's also scrabbling for them. So that's one of the reasons I liked writing, was because it's not quite such a zero-sum game as academia can be.
Mm.
Just because someone else got published doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get published. So there's a little bit more room to be excited for other people when they have successes, which I really I like.
Did it take you long to find a publisher or an agent, whatever came first?
Yeah, it felt like it took forever, but it actually wasn't too bad. I I'd written Sight Unseen about 12 times. And it was me learning how to write a novel. And that's first I started writing it from the third person. And that was real. I mean, I was boring myself. And if you're boring yourself, something, it's not going to speak to a reader. Um, I'm like, okay, what do people find interesting about me? I'm like, well, they like my emails and they like when I tell funny stories. So I'll set it in the first person. And all of a sudden, I was able to sort of walk around in Emma's shoes. And that felt immediately much more comfortable. And I was able to put some of my observations of humanity or academia and life in the universe and everything into Emma. And it started to really work then. But when I finally had a finished draft and I went to the Fred Loaf Writers Convention, is the convention conference that I mentioned in Millbury, Vermont, where I met that very influential instructor of mine, David Bradley, who was a magnificent writer. When I realized he was going to be my instructor, I had read his book and I'm like, I can't show him my little mystery. This guy has like won Penn Faulkner and all these prestigious awards. And so my husband said, well, you're going. You got in, you're going. And if I have to, have a friend kick you out of the truck and we take off, so you don't chicken out, we'll do that. But I went, and it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. But at that point, I also met a person who would become my first agent. And she and I hit it off. I wrote a couple of drafts, and then within a year or so, she had sold it to Avon, and then it took a little while longer. So when you write your first book, you have the luxury of taking as many months as many drafts as you need. When you write your second and third book or you have a contract, you learn to be very efficient about your process, whatever that might be. And you don't have the luxury of doing it 12 or 13 times before you feel like you get it right. But you've also learned so much from doing it the first time that it gives you a boost. So it took about, I think at one point, when I first was published, a lot of folks were asking me. I wrote about 12 different query letters to agents. And it was eventually, that's about the average I've had. My first, and I've had 3 agents, 2 of whom have passed away, and my third agent, it took about 10 or 12 tries, which is actually pretty good. So I felt reassured about that. Even when they said it's not quite for me, but you have something someone will love, just not me. And that's the best kind of rejection. You have bad rejections where they send you a form letter with an ad for their book about getting published. And then there's the good rejection. It's like, no, it's not quite there for me, but someone, or write another draft and show me that. To um, a bad acceptance, like, well, we'll do this and that and other thing, and you'll get $10. And I'm like, no. uh, and to a good acceptance. And you have to sort of not look at it as binary, as black and white, but just say there's a whole spectrum of responses to your work that can give you information about how to proceed. So if it always feels like it takes forever, it's only after about 20 years that I've learned to fire and forget, which is you just send something out into the world and then don't dwell on it. The first time I was sitting there, the phone, like checking, making sure the phone was working, the landline, because we didn't have cell phones in those days, and making sure I didn't get too far away in case my agent should call me within the week. And it doesn't work like that. It's always hurry up and wait. And it took me a long time not to have that. My entire writing career rests on everything. It doesn't, you never know what's going to happen, and you never know what you might try. So,
Well, we're at the top of the hour. Ellis, do you have any closing remarks?
Well, I certainly did enjoy it.
thank you so
No.
much.
I was delighted that you could come and talk with us.
Mhm.
The books were good, and I'm interested in Emma Hoyt now. Anna Hoyt.
Oh,
Emma Fielding.
Anna Hoyt is she's a lot different from Emma Fielding. It was written in the noir style.
Mm.
So it's very gritty. It's much more violent. It was based on a short story called Femme Soul that was in Boston Noir, which was edited by Dennis Lehane. So it is going to be a very different experience, but I hope you will enjoy it because I loved writing it. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, and it's also one of the things I'm most proud of because she's not to everyone's taste, but you can feel her desperation to survive in a very difficult situation. Um, and she sometimes reminded me as a person to keep struggling, keep fighting, keep working towards what you want to have happen. But my methods are not as nasty as hers. So I hope you will enjoy her, Ellis. And thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Mm.
I'm so glad you came.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
absolutely
Yes,
my
we
pleasure.
really enjoyed it. Much appreciated, Dana.
My pleasure. And I hope you have fun with the other books.
I'm sure we will.
Okay. And thank you again for having me. It was a treat. It brought up a lot of memories that were very happy ones for me. So I appreciate
Good,
that.
I'm
Great.
glad.
Okay. Stay safe during the weather.
Yes.
Oh, you too. You're
Uh,
in worse place than I am.
well, it depends. I go to New York for a Sherlock Holmes event every year, the Baker Street Irregulars, and usually there's either a blizzard or it's 40 degrees. So I don't know what we're gonna get next week.
Oh,
But thanks again for having me. And when the video's up, let me know and I'll make sure to put it out into the social media so other folks can have fun with
I
it
will
too.
do that. Okay,
Awesome.
signing off.
Okay, thanks, Sally. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Mm-mm.